So I'm gonna set a good example here. I'm gonna turn my cell phone off. I'm gonna turn my cell phone down here. Let's make sure there's no interruptions that are unnecessary during the panel. Good to see you, sir. How are you? And I'm Mike Pregent. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the C-SPAN audience for being here as well, for being able to watch this. This is a timely panel, a series of panels on the Iraqi elections. And I have with me today a group of experts on Iraq, and two Iraqis specifically that have just recently come back, and then Jomana, who's a Syrian American, who just came back as well in a different role. And I'm going to have them all speak about their recent experiences, the current situation in Iraq as it pertains to three major issues: the Shia protests in the south, security backslide issues, and government formation. And the government formation part can actually exacerbate these issues. So we're looking at all those things. We're going to continue to do these panels, and we're going to continue to bring experts, and hopefully you'll be able to join again as this government formation takes place, so that we can see where we were right, see where we were wrong, and see how not surprised we are at how right and wrong we were, because Iraq is constantly moving around and changing. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. Can I borrow that real quick just to make sure?
The what? This is not the...
This is not the sheet? Okay.
I think we left it.
This is great. I left my sheet where I was going to say all these wonderful things about them in the office. All right. So to the far left there is Omar Badawi. He is the director of...
Iraq director at Gryphon Partners.
Gryphon Partners, sorry about that. And he has a lot of experience with looking at U.S. foreign policy in Iraq, looking at the current situation in Iraq, and his perspectives are going to be great with this panel, because as you know, I'm kind of a counter-narrative guy. I criticize U.S. foreign policy, I talk about the narratives that were coming out of Iraq, and this would be a good opportunity to hear Iraqis challenge those narratives and tell us which way we need to go. And I'm always happy to be wrong, and I hope you can set me on the right track. And to his right is Jomana Qaddour, and she, what's that? And she recently came back from Iraq. She was in a position where she looked at refugees across different sects, human rights issues in Iraq across different sects.
Senior policy analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom.
Right.
Yes.
And in that, you went and visited these refugee centers and looked at some of the human rights issues and the government responses to these things. And it's great to have your perspective here, because you could actually give us some of the atmospheric, some of the actual pulse of the Iraqis that were actually in these positions, and what they thought about government formation, or government in general, and especially U.S. foreign policy. And Ahmed Ali, somebody I've known for over a decade, who's Iraqi, who covers all these issues, who worked at the Institute for the Study of War and was their Iraq analyst, did some great work there. I've often cited his work. And it's good to have him give us a pulse of what the Iraqis are thinking as well. And he's our most recent returnee from Iraq, as we look at the different political parties in Iraq that are vying for power and that are trying to form these alliances. So in this format, we basically try to run this like a Sunday morning news format. I'm going to throw out a scene setter, and then we're just going to throw different issues to our panelists. And basically, we're talking about today. There are three main issues. We have Shia protests in the south, not only the burning down of the Iranian consulate, but also the burning down of Dawa Party offices, Kitab Hezbollah offices, Badr Corps offices, and Asab al-Haq offices, and all those different names. That is a rejection by the Iraqi people of the increasing Iranian influence in Iraq by targeting religious entities, or political entities and militias tied to Iran. And then you have ISIS, a resurgence in ISIS in Kirkuk, in Salahuddin, in Diyala provinces, where our campaign has basically said ISIS is defeated, yet you can look at ISIS attacks every day. And then the big one, government formation and the continuing shifting alliances. We now see Hadi al-Amri and Muqtada al-Sadr forming an alliance, which means you have Sariyun, who won the most votes, and then you have Fatah, which came in second, marginalizing the U.S. preferred candidate Abadi and his Nasser party. So I'm going to throw that to Ahmed. I know that's a lot, but Ahmed, just let us know what's going on in Iraq, man, from your
That's good.
perspective.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Mike, for having us, and thank you for organizing these panels, which I think are very important, because last time we had a major war in Iraq was by 2010, and by 2010, this town, a lot of analysts in this town, they forgot about Iraq, and then all of a sudden we had ISIS. So I think it's important to keep attention on Iraq and what's happening in Iraq. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not thank you for your service to our nation, to the United States, for 28 years working with the U.S. military in different capacities. So I'm a regular traveler to Iraq, and I just got back on Sunday, actually, from the country. And every time I go, I have the ability to travel, within different parts of the country, and clearly interview and talk to different personalities, stakeholders, and people interested in the politics of the country. And I think with these elections, with the May 12th elections, they seem very long time ago, but they really are. We have to still analyze the implications of what happened since May 12th, and the issues that came up since May 12th, and how they affect the way Iraqis and the average Iraqis perceive the political system in Iraq. I think, Mike, right now we have a major crisis for the political system in Iraq. There's a legitimacy question about the political system in Iraq, and Iraqis who endorsed the politics of the country for a very long time. I don't think the majority of Iraqis, if you do polling now, would see elections as a way, or politics in general, as a conducive avenue to address their grievances, to address their needs. And that doesn't only cover the Iraqi Sunnis, for example, who have always seen the political process as not necessarily representative of their ambitions, but it covers all Iraqis. I would say the Iraqi Shia, the protests that you mentioned that have been taking place in Basra, these are by the Iraqi Shia, and young Iraqi Shia who do not remember Saddam Hussein anymore. They look at 2003 and they see a political class that has not delivered for the country, and they're upset. And even though the political class is dominated by Iraqi Shia, they don't see that as representative of their ambition. And same thing, if you go to Iraqi Kurdistan, it's people are also very concerned about the political system and the nature of the political system, and they're voicing that concern. And I think as you and I always talk, Mike, indicators and warnings, right?
Right.
The indicators and warnings for the dissatisfaction that Iraqis, from all backgrounds, have is the low turnout that we saw on election day, which was a big crisis. So I have that. I wanted to say that, and I'm clearly speaking for myself here. But on the government formation, we're also entering a very crucial period of time right now. We had the election of the speaker, Speaker Mohammed Halbousi, who's a young guy. He's 36 years old. He's as old as I am, which tells you something about where people end up in life. But he is from an Iraqi Sunni political party. He's backed by Iraqi Sunnis. If you look at the Iraqi press now, you see a lot of coverage of his election and what it means for the country. And I think so far we were unable to say if he will be more closer to the Iranian government, for example, or closer to us. I think it's too early to tell, and what I have learned about Iraqi politics, just being inside the process in various capacities, is that it does take some time until we know the direction in which every position will go, and the players and the decisions they take. And clearly today we also have the nomination of Dr. Barham Saleh, the former Prime Minister of the Kurdistan Regional Government, by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan to be the president of the country. It's only an early nomination. We have to wait until October 2nd, and after that the Iraqi Parliament will have to sit down and decide whether vote on Dr. Barham Saleh or somebody else. But Dr. Barham Saleh clearly is a well-known person internationally and even domestically. So this is where we are today in terms of how the population feels about the political process, and also the political dynamic as it stands today.
So I want to ask you, Omar, if there was an election, based on what Ahmed has said, if there was a redo of the election, Will we still see the same outcome based on what's transpired since the? So we had about 25% turnout in Iraq in this election.
Yeah.
And will we still see the same turnout based on these uprisings? We now see disenfranchised. We've now seen the Shia population of Iraq join the disenfranchised communities of the Sunnis and join the disenfranchised communities in northern Iraq and the Kurdish regions. So what would an election today look like based on the things that have changed since May 8th?
So I think I agree with Ahmed that Iraq's problem is, to a great extent, a crisis of credibility and legitimacy of the current political order, to where of what the political class has taken the political process to. The official numbers, I think, for the turnout in this election was 44%, which is the lowest, if true, the lowest turnout in any Iraqi election since 2003. But like you said, there's speculation that the numbers were even much lower than that, in the 20s and even below. And that was compounded by the fact that there are serious suspicions of electoral fraud. Right. And those were not really sufficiently addressed by the partial recount that took place after that actually deepened the sense that there was, some foul play. We had the warehouse that housed the ballots set ablaze, obviously by or ostensibly by parties that were trying to hide some of the traces of the manipulation, and we had a council of commissioners of the electoral commission that was sacked and replaced, and even with the recount, with all the suspicious conditions that were associated with that, we had a recount that didn't really produce any change in results. So I think that deepened the suspicion of, or let's say, deepened the credibility, the doubts about the credibility of the results and of whether the current political class, the people who are sitting now in parliament, were actually, chosen by the people. Now, if Iraq was to have another election, the question is, can Iraq have another election? I think the issue of what I just mentioned has really delegitimized the commission, the election commission, in the eyes of many Iraqis, and this will have to be addressed before any elections can happen. And this includes, not only future general elections, but also the provincial elections, which are to happen in, I think, in December. And I wonder what Ahmed actually has to say about this. Is he travels to the provinces more frequently. The current situation with the protests, I think, makes it really essential that Iraq has a new set of provincial governments that are really reflective of the people's choices in these provinces to address their problems. So I think if Iraq were to have another election, assuming that that's possible, I don't think we're going to see better turnout than last time. We might see that the trend of boycott go even farther than it did in the May 12 election, which is really doesn't really help Iraq. I hope that Iraqi voters have learned that partial boycott only helps those who manipulate results and those who can mobilize a solid and more zealot base of voters. And I hope that Iraqi voters will see that in the future and try to be more assertive in going out and voting on an election day to make their voice heard and to, have increases their leverage in challenging the results and demanding accountability eventually. So I think the bottom line is one of the biggest tests that Iraq will face is restoring the credibility of the electoral process. And to be honest, the situation with the government formation right now doesn't bode well. What we see is a trend of the primacy of transactional politics And I think it's important to think of not only what we see, but also what we don't see. What we're not seeing is a discussion, an open discussion about policies, platforms, and government programs. But what we see and hear are under-the-table deals in which people are paying others to buy out government positions. Now, the damage is done whether these rumors are true or not.
Right.
Because once it's out, it's out.
Perception is it's happening.
But logically, if being in a position of power can generate revenue for the person holding it, then I think it makes sense that that person will be ready to pay for it.
Right.
And this really does not promise. I think it sets the bar too low for expectations from the next government that Iraq's going to have.
Right. And Jomana, in your travels to Iraq, did you start seeing some of the undercurrents of this disenfranchisement across Iraq, not only in the Sunni and the Kurdish areas, but this distrust of government institutions and basically a question of who's going to do something about this?
Sure. So I was last there in late March. So that was right before, we were probably one of the last U.S. delegations that was allowed to go to Iraq before the elections, because we didn't want to give any perception that the United States was trying to meddle with election results. We went to Baghdad and to Erbil, and I think at the time we were getting really mixed readouts in Baghdad, because we would talk to some of our folks on the ground from the embassy, as well as Iraqi judges and other Iraqi government officials who would tell us, for the first time, sectarianism is not an issue in these elections. Identity politics is not playing a factor. Even if the militias win, you have to understand that they have over, 90% support of the people, and that we need to let these elections play out because they are representative of the people's actual feelings. In Erbil, we obviously got a very different readout, because you had a lot of the minority populations who were very skeptical.
Who was telling you that? These U.S. officials in Baghdad telling you this?
I'd rather keep it sort of vague. So it was a mix of...
So U.S. officials, okay.
Well, but also...
I'm kidding.
But also Iraqis
Right.
themselves from a variety of different backgrounds. So when you went to Erbil, obviously the perception was quite different. We would talk to Kurdish officials who would tell us something different, as well as Christian, Shabak, other minority communities, all of whom were very skeptical about the actual distribution of funds accordingly and properly throughout Iraq. What's interesting about these protests is that something very similar happened, about 2 summers ago, but it did not blow up to the level we've seen it now, because Sistani at the time didn't really give it that seal of approval that he has now, where he said any current government official and any previous government, government leaders are not allowed to run, which has put Abadi and Maliki completely out of, as non-starters in terms of who can be the next prime minister of Iraq. And I think this is very important. What's interesting about Basra is it provides 80% of the country's oil exports and provides $7 billion worth of oil money to Iraq per month. I mean, that's a huge amount of money, none of which the people in Basra are seeing. 17,000 people were hospitalized because the water is contaminated. There's no electricity. And you have a bunch of unemployed youth who are like, you know what, we have nothing to lose. If these elections, if the people in power who are elected in power cannot even form a government, let alone actually allocate funds accordingly, then our province is just being exploited. And we're going to put a stop to this. And if that means we have to protest every day, then we will. And 15 Basrawis have been killed as a result, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting in that this Iraqi youth movement across provinces, across this sectarian divide, is cultivating leaders that are not affiliated with the traditional religious parties. They're cultivating leaders that are social media influencers, that are professors, that are entrepreneurs. And this bodes well for 2021 elections, to cultivate these leaders that are outside of the traditional status quo religious parties. Do they have a chance to succeed if these status quo politicians and their political parties continue to treat their population this way? This is the loudest voice. This is the first time all of Iraq is saying enough with this malign Iranian influence on our government, our Shia political parties. They're sending a message, not only with burning down the Iranian consulate, which you can see in the screens here, but sending a message to Baghdad that this is not how you treat us anymore.
I think, Mike, if I may just answer this question, because I work with Iraqi youth to a great extent, and when you meet with them, this is exactly what what you said is exactly what they tell you, is that we don't see this political system as our political system. We don't necessarily remember what Saddam Hussein did. And when I say Iraqis, I mean all Iraqis, who live in Iraq at the moment as, a territorial, country.
60% of the population is under the age of 30.
Absolutely, starting from, Kurdistan all the way to Basra. And they're very frustrated with the political elite. And they don't only see that the political elite is playing and a very unproductive role in leading the country, but they also see, as you mentioned, other countries, playing a role in the country that's not for the interest of Iraq necessarily. And I mean, in the case of Basra, I was pretty, surprised that the Iranian consulate was burned down. I think this is a milestone for events in Iraq, that the Iranian consulate in Basra, which is literally geographically Iran's backyard, was burned down by young protesters. And I thought it sent a strong message, throughout the country about how Iraqis see the foreign influence of different countries. There was an attempt to also go after the U.S. consulate in Basra, which, as you know,
but not from the protesters. It was the militias.
It has never been attributed, but somebody tried to go there, but there was a strong push to prevent that, and that also sends a strong message about the position of the U.S. in the eyes of the Iraqis these days, because, as you know, you served in Mosul and you served in Anbar, I'm sure, in which perceptions and perspectives change about the role of the U.S. In Anbar, they used to attack us, attack U.S. forces from 03. I remember when I was in Baghdad, in May of 03, I started hearing people from Fallujah saying we were going to do something about the presence of the U.S. and something not productive, but then by 06 it changed, right? So there's a changing the dynamic, but those youth, I think if we look at 2022, that's where the U.S. can play a role in, first of all, keeping an eye on the country, and second, engaging Iraqis people to people, not meet with the same people, not engage the same people, because that engaging the same people can also harm the image of the U.S. and the.
Yeah, I'd like to take back my statement. You're right. The Shia youth in Basra would have every right to try to storm the U.S. consulate as well, because they continue to see the U.S. prop up these religious parties that have not served them well. It's the U.S. position that the status quo stays intact, and so I wouldn't be surprised. I was just talking specifically about the mortar attack on the consulate, which was attributed to AH. Two different efforts.
I mean, this goes to the backslide in security that you talked about. It's not only ISIS, but you see other sorts of activities that, when you look at it from a security perspective, is also concerning. Who's carrying out those kinds of activities is never easy to tell. But if you look at indicators and warnings, I think you can tell who's carrying out those activities.
Do you want to follow up on that?
Sure. I think. One of the important things that we need to look at is not only the burning of the Iranian consulate in Basra tells us, but also the fact that the Iranians reopened the consulate 4 days later. I think that sends an important message, a sinister message, that Iran is not going to give up easily. That is committed to maintaining a deep influence in that city and Iraq in general. If that was the German or the Saudi or the Mexican consulate in an Iraqi city, it would take 4 years probably for that country to regroup and decide and reconsider and reopen a consulate. But the Iranians are not wasting time about this. To your question on whether the Iraqi youth have a chance in 2022, I think we might have a showdown probably sooner than that.
Right.
I think as September and October roll in and the season changes, and don't underestimate the importance of weather in Iraq and the heat and what the heat can do to social dynamics. It's not a surprise that several of Iraq's revolutions and coups happened in July. The political elite might might be saved by the weather, I think, in September, October, but things will come to another showdown, I think, in next summer if the new government does not change does not change and improve on the legacy of its predecessors. And, my prediction is it's not. At best, it's going to match the past. That's not going to be enough. We're going to have another escalation next year. Now, that could mean that opens up a lot of possibilities for the future. It could be faced by strong repressive action, and we already see signs of some of the Iran-affiliated militias and parties trying to create kind of like a copy of the Basij, of the voluntary mobilization force in Basra, to kind of create a reserve to try and not control just the intersections and the important sites, but also the street on the more granular level.
Can they do that in addition to providing security for the Iranian consulate?
We'll see about that. So, what this means for the future is that they are, I think, the political parties, especially those with armed wings, they anticipate a clash. They anticipate a train wreck coming. They anticipate
with Iraqis,
with the Iraqi youth, and that's what their preparations are saying. So this could turn into a chronic repressive situation. Iraq could become, in a way, similar to where Iran is today, where you have a large segment of the population that is disillusioned with the regime and is yearning for change, but the regime has, through its, party, militia, and street militia organizations, capable of maintaining security, or things could, blow out of control. So I think the next 12 months are going to be quite interesting in Iraq, quite dangerous in Iraq, I think.
And I'm sure during your time, Jomana, you saw the reports of Sunni males disappeared by militias. Some of the militias taking people away. We've seen reports where both Abadi and the U.S. government representatives have said that they're looking into these reports of people disappearing. But in these protests in the South, we've also seen the militias disappear Shia male youth that are part of these protests. And these are things that are going on almost at a more rapid rate than are going on in Iran, with the number of Iraqis that have been killed in protests versus the number of Iranians that have been killed by Basij forces or other forces. So with all these indicators, do you agree with Omar that we're likely to see clashes with Iraqis against this status quo, now that the status quo is armed with militias that are backed by a foreign power?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think I agree with both of my co-panelists on these issues. But yeah, you're right. When we were in Baghdad, we met with Iraqi judges who we talked and confronted sort of about the de-ISISification camps that they have, especially throughout the north, where you are guilty by association if your cousin happened to have joined ISIS, or if you came from a certain village where there were many different people who joined ISIS. So we also saw very public images of Sunni men being dragged by Shia militias throughout the city. So this is a real phenomenon.
In Baghdad.
No, so this is in the north, but we were talking with Iraqi judges in Baghdad.
Right.
But absolutely, I think in the past couple of, actually since late July, since the Basra protests, we've seen, youth being hit on television and attacked and et cetera by these militias. And I agree with them in that the clashes are definitely not just, I think it happens to be more intra-Shia now because the Shias happen to control more power in Iraq right now. You have the Sunnis who have, after depacification, you had them confront then Al-Qaeda was a problem within the community, then ISIS. Now a lot of them have been displaced. And so you have, the Sunnis are really, they're not together. They haven't, I mean, they're not able to join any of the coalitions because they really don't have a united front. Even Halbusi, to be honest, I mean, the reason why he was able to really be appointed as Speaker of the Parliament is also because of the support he received from Fatah very recently. It was made very public that he received critical support from the Shia militias to move forward in that capacity. And he, as a Sunni, publicly said that the Iraq will not be complying with U.S. sanctions against Iran. So I don't want to dumb it down to sectarianism or to identity politics. I think it does a disservice really to the more pervasive issues in Iraq. I think it comes really down to politicized patronage networks that even Abbadi, who is considered in our eyes sort of the least of all evils, is very guilty of. I mean, he controls to some extent some of the government coffers, and he does use them to spend on those who support him politically in the same way that many of the Shia militias and ministers in parliament do. They all play the same game, regardless of sect.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, it's the strongest tribe concept. I interviewed some Ramadi tribal sheikhs after the Mosul offensive. And they basically said, if the U.S. isn't going to be our ally, then we're going to go with Iran. We're going to go with the strongest tribe, the strongest player on the field. And you see that with Halbusi. You see that with the PUK. You see that with other groups that have actually tilted towards these positions, not because of necessarily sectarianism or it doesn't play a role. It's about who's the main player, who is invested in this game. And you can say positive things like, well, Halbusi is now the Speaker of the Parliament. He's Sunni. And now we have Barham Salwa. He's Kurd. Look at this unity government. But it's really the ones that are lining up with the most
That's because it's
player.
mandated in the Constitution to be divided along sectarian lines.
Yeah. But
it's not necessarily that they agree.
No, there'll never be a Sunni prime minister. There'll never be a Kurdish prime minister. It'll always be a Shia.
Mandated.
No, it's just what we did. It's the Min Shuarab. It's the Al-Rasi.
Exactly.
The political. No, but I think, Mike, what you talk about as well is that, and what Jomana said, Omar said as well, and what we see on the ground as well, it's about governance. What people want is good governance. They don't really care about the ethnicity or the sect of the person who's going to give them good governance. I guarantee it, if the governor of Basra is an Iraqi Sunni but is a good governor, the people of Basra are not going to say he's an Iraqi Sunni. People who care about the service delivery and having good services. And I think as well, what will be just important moving forward, even in terms of governance, is the role of the U.S. Because even when you look at the protests in Basra, the Iranian press came out very strongly and accused our Consul General in Basra, Timmy Davis, of orchestrating all these protests, even though Timmy Davis, Consul Timmy Davis is one of the most active, diplomats in Iraq, but not in the way that the Iranian media portrayed it. So there is that perception as well that the U.S. is very active in Iraq. The U.S. is doing work on the ground in Iraq and is engaged with multiple actors, which I think is very important. And sometimes in D.C. we tend to look at the big names and what they do, but there are other the U.S. diplomats who really who are trying to build this people-to-people relations, which we, I think, as the United States, failed to build over the last 15 years. When it's difficult for an American to go to Iraq and travel freely in some parts, that's not a good outcome after 15 years of investing in Iraq, right?
Exactly.
But now we see some changes in that direction with the work of some of the U.S. diplomats that we have in the country.
And the biggest problem is those diplomats will rotate out of Iraq in the next 3 to 6 months, and we'll have brand new ones coming in.
I see many colleagues from the State Department in the audience, and I have expressed this to them privately. I think that has to change, but it's difficult to change. That rotation system is difficult to change. So that's why, and as you know from the Iraqis, the same face sometimes is important as long as that face is effective and able to deliver on the promise.
As long as it's not Brett McGurk.
I mean, I don't, I don't know about that, but I think
That's just me, so I know my panelists don't agree with it.
no, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think, the Iraqis, they appreciate, sustained engagement and, people who understand them and people who get to know their background. And right now with the diplomatic team, U.S. diplomatic team in country, there's some of that. And that's why Iraqis, care about the panel that we're having now. They care about
They do care about it. And on a serious note about Brett McGurk condemned the attack on the Iranian consulate. And Iraqis wondered why he did that. He recently asked Sunni COR members to back Abadi, and they publicly stated that he was trying to pressure them and that they went against his recommendations. And he's lost a lot of trust with the Kurdish party specifically, based on the actions over the last year. So as you look at these U.S. engagement in Iraq, you keep hearing these narratives that everything's okay. I heard something from DOD today that I couldn't believe, that the U.S. has more influence in Baghdad than Iran does, and that we've never been stronger with the Kurds than we are now. And I can't disagree with those two narratives more. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think I would probably disagree a little bit with that. I think a number of things that are important to remember here is that Iran is very difficult to compete with in terms of conducting diplomacy and building relationships. We have a textbook that we have to follow. We have rules, we have protocol, we have law. Iran has a lot more flexibility because is not really bound by these things. And it has been building relationships for decades. Hadi al-Amiri, who was the leader of the second largest bloc in parliament right now, he fought alongside Qasem Soleimani in the trenches in the Iran-Iraq war. Now how do you match that? What kind of relationship?
You ignore it. Because that's what we've been doing. You ignore that relationship.
So you can't, it is not easy to compete with that. You have to think of really creatively about creating other means of leverage and using that smartly to compete with this depth of relationships that Iran has created. And I think, similar goes for, similar trends in the Kurdish question. I think the Kurdish leadership didn't exactly hide their rather dissatisfaction with the U.S. position and handling of the post-referendum tension between the Kurdistan region government and the government in Baghdad. And I think they were sending indications that, you didn't come to our aid when we needed you. We'll have to, to live with geography and live with the realities of our position here, and make things work with the actor that is involved and calling the shots on the ground.
Consistent.
Yeah.
And you and I spoke about that distrust that started to grow after the Gulf War, after we encouraged a revolution and then abandoned a revolution, a Shia revolution against Saddam, and then Saddam put it down.
Not, I think, by design. I don't think that was intentional, but it was if we go back to those events, it was probably a jumping the gun on supporting an initiative that
it's something we do in the
U.S. diplomacy, U.S. position as a leader of the coalition couldn't possibly support without undoing that very coalition that existed for a specific purpose, which was restoring Kuwait's sovereignty, rather than taking out the sovereignty of another.
It's something we're very good at, declaring victory and then leaving and allowing all these things to happen. We continue to do that. President Obama did that with Iraq when he left, and President Trump almost did that with Syria until he was encouraged to stay in, because the last thing you want to do is have a bumper sticker campaign where you've declared victory over something. We saw George Bush do that as well, declaring victory after the invasion of Baghdad. And these bumper sticker campaigns actually lead to security backslide. And we'll talk about security backslide in a little while. But the Sistani fatwas, how are they? My perception is they're listened to when they're popular and they're ignored when they're not. Is that fair? Is it,
I mean, he's incredibly popular right now, and I think he's playing a very critical role. I think, I mean, Sistani, when it was, after the Kurdish referendum, when he stepped in and said, you have to halt the fighting. He's very strategic about when he decides to say something or not, at least when it comes, I think, to the strife that's happening, the conflict, the direct confrontation between various Iraqi parties. And I think right now, it's tricky because has this veto power over individuals who may not be in the best interest, for Iraq's long-term interests, Abbadi and Maliki, and Amri as well. But at the same time, do you want Iraq to be susceptible always to, needing the religious establishment and Najaf to come in and say, guys, stop, you have to find a different solution or what have you. Like, having a cleric needing to step into politics, I don't think is in the long-term interest of any Middle Eastern country.
Is it in U.S. interest to oppose Sistani and continue to push Prime Minister Abbadi as a candidate when Sistani has said no?
No, I don't think we should be opposing him.
But we are.
Sure, but I think that we should be, I think, in my opinion, listening a bit to what he has to say, because I do think he's a bit more pragmatic than some of the other actors that are on the scene. And he has a pretty good pulse, and he does have a huge following that I think we should definitely take into consideration.
If I may add a few things, I don't think Ayatollah Sistani likes to be dragged into politics very often. I think, the Iraqi people generally, and the Shia community specifically, they have more admiration for religious leaders who don't get involved in public commentary on politics day in and day out. So it is political capital that is being expended every time Najaf has to say something and has to rule into political matters. I think with the Marja'iyya had quite a period of not really intervening much in politics until 2014, when they had to intervene and call for for people to volunteer to save the country from ISIS.
A popular fatwa.
It was a popular fatwa that was manipulated. I think it was by some political actors. The fatwa was never about forming auxiliary forces outside.
But when Sistani said to stop that, they still did it anyway.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. Once you set a momentum in one direction, it's difficult to control it, and especially in a state of war. I think that al-Sistani would rather not get involved, but he is under pressure. I think there's pressure. People expect guidance when they see the way that the political elites are dealing very lightly with the fate and the future of the country. I don't know how much the latest fatwa on the nomination of the prime minister is going to affect things, because again, the transactional nature of the government formation process now might override that, and that would generally not be a good thing for the image of the Marja'iyya.
Right.
We'll see.
I think Michael, with Grand Ayatollah Sistani, he sent a very clear message about his views with regards to the political system before the elections. A week before the elections, when one of his representatives gave a speech in Karbala and did not urge Iraqis to go vote. It just said, it's your choice whether you vote or not. And I think that speech contributed to the low turnout that we saw on election day. So Grand Ayatollah Sistani also knows the pulse of the street very well. His office and also people close to him, they know the pulse of the street better than I'd say even myself. because they always study it. So the message was clear, is that the political system is very unpopular with the population, and therefore the Grand Ayatollah cannot support it at this point, because, as Omar said, it's about political capital, and Grand Ayatollah Sistani, he's not inclined to use his political capital every Friday.
Right.
It's about the big moments and the big issues, clearly.
Jomana, do you want to say something?
No, I fully agree with him.
Okay. So let's talk about government formation. The latest alliance seems to be between Hadi al-Amri and Muqtada al-Sadr. So Hadi al-Amri's Fatah Party and Muqtada al-Sadr's Syrian Party. So for those in our audience that don't know who Hadi al-Amri is, he's the commander of Badr Corps, an IRGC Quds Force grown, developed, trained, and financed militia that is in Iraq. He is the head of a political party. He's worked with the U.S. before. He's worked with us when we fought Al-Qaeda. He always denied his role as Badr commander until the ISIS offensive in 2014. And the Fatah Party is also asking for the immediate exit of the United States. This combined with joining Sarayun, Muqtada al-Sadr, the commander of Jaish al-Mahdi, back in the day, which was responsible for a lot of American deaths in Iraq, who has moderated his position and has tried to tilt away from Iran, is now combining with Iran's political party in Iraq. This is the first time a political party in Iraq has an armed wing that is not only Badr Corps, but is comprised of Kitab Hezbollah, a foreign terrorist organization, Harakat Nujaba, who's being brought up for sanctions in the Senate, Asab Ahl-Haq, another IRGC Quds Force militia that's being brought up for sanctions. This is the Fatah Party. How do you feel as Iraqis that this party and Sarayun are forming an alliance where Sadr said he would never join with Hadi al-Amri, said he would never join with Maliki, but I think this grouping of state of law and Sarayun means that, Fatah and Sarayun means that SOL is going to be part of this as well.
I don't think so, Mike. I think with
Good.
So what we see right now with the Iraqi Shia political scene, because it's all by stages. The first stage was the Iraqi political scene, and with the election of Speaker Halbusi, we know where it stands now. We know where we know the general outline of it. Now with the Iraqi Kurdish political scene, with the nomination by the PUK of Dr. Barham Saleh, we know where the Iraqi Kurdish.
These are the traditional positions, though, right?
Right.
A Sunni takes over the COR,
Exactly.
a Kurd takes over the presidency, and these are
It's a political
this would happen
understanding.
regardless, right?
Yeah, I mean,
A few modifications.
Yes.
a few modifications. But so now we're about to find out, what is what is the scene, or what is the attitude within the Iraqi Shia political camps. And I think the driving force right now by Fatah, by Sairun, by Hadi al-Amri and Muqtada al-Sadr, is possibly to actually eliminate Dawa as the dominant political party in the Iraqi political scene, because the Dawa political party, I don't think many people know, it has been ruling Iraq for the last 13 years.
Yeah, these protests are against Dawa.
Exactly. So 13 years out of the 15 years that the war had, that Saddam was removed, is a long time. So a lot of people see the Dawa Party as the cause of many of the problems that Iraq has today on service delivery, the political culture that has developed within the country. So now I think Sairun and Fatah, maybe they see this as their opportunity to deal Dawa a very strong blow, because what happened with the election of Speaker Halbusi, and that's why I think I try to stay away from who won, Iran or the U.S. Even with the Halbusi, the Halbusi election, is that it was about the Iraqi political scene, because the dominant, as you know from the Anbar days in particular, the dominant political force within the Iraqi political scene is the Iraqi Islamic Party, the IIP. Which also dominated since 2005. When everybody boycotted the elections in those provinces, the IIP was the only one that said go vote, right? And they control the position since then. So the IIP now is in a much weaker position in the Iraqi.
Can you tell our viewers IIP what it stands for?
The Iraqi Islamic Party.
Okay.
The Iraqi Islamic Party. So I forgot about our viewers on C-SPAN in particular. My favorite channel. So I would say now we're looking at this as a very strong competition within the Iraqi Shia political scene about the future of Dawah and what it means, what Iraq means post-Dawah, really.
The most interesting photo I saw was one where they merged Abadi and Maliki together in their protest in Basra. Now, don't Iraqis also consider Abadi part of this Dawa machine?
I think at the moment, yes. I think before a month and a half ago, my answer would have been no. Actually, 2 months ago, before the beginning of these protests. Now he's widely seen as part of the Dawa political environment, which I think it speaks to the calculation that Prime Minister Abadi made when the Basra protests picked up, by June, mid-June, right. Or actually, more on July 12th, to be more exact.
Will any rejection of Maliki's Dawa Party have to include Fatah as well, though? Because Hadi al-Amri and Maliki are very close. Has there been a schism between state of law and Fatah that we're not aware of?
I mean, I don't mean to monopolize, but because I follow this very closely, I think the relationship between Hadi al-Amri and Vice President Maliki is still close as far as we can tell. But I can easily predict that if it comes down to making sure Dawa is weaker, Hadi al-Amri will be okay with not working with Maliki or sidelining Maliki to an extent, because Dawa has been too dominant in the eyes of many Iraqi Shia political parties, and including, even these days, the Dawa Party is going through its own crisis, and there might be a decision to kick out, Prime Minister Abadi from Dawa
right.
because of his positions. So there's a lot of turmoil within Dawa these days as well.
Omar, do you want to say anything?
Well, I think I agree with Ahmed. I think there is a desire among the winning parties to end that monopoly that the Iraqi Islamic Party has, had over the speakership of parliament, and that the Dawa Party has had over the premiership, and to basically collect on their winnings. And now the Dawa Party seems to be at its weakest point. Its leaderships are divided. It's technically split into two, as the junior partners in two competing coalitions. And I still wouldn't call Sa'irun and Fatah an alliance at this point.
It changes every week.
I think it's very fluid. We had, before the election, Prime Minister Abadi aligned himself in that infamous 24-hour alliance with Fatah, which Sadr called appalling and condemned strongly. Right. And then Muqtada Sadr, he aligned himself with Prime Minister Abadi after the elections, and now he's aligning himself with Hadi al-Amri. So things are fluid, and I think they will change as things shape up. So the die is not cast there.
Are you comfortable with predictions?
Now, when it comes to the Prime Minister, even though Dawa itself might be out, the question is what kind of formula they're going to find to select a Prime Minister. And if you look at the criteria, Dawa kind of found itself, the party that nominated the Prime Minister several times, because it's the one party that didn't have a militia, and it was kind of like the weakest person at the table. So who's going to replace that? Which party within the establishment is going to play that role?
Is that Hikmah now? The Hikmah party? Is it?
That's that's a possibility.
Is it Alawi's party? Is it?
That's a possibility, but I think it will have to be a weak political. It has to be one of the weaker elements of the political establishment, not an empowered one. And I think, I don't know what probably the U.S. prefers a strong and empowered prime minister, but I think Iran probably prefers a prime minister who is beholden.
Compromise candidate.
The more strings that there are that you can pull at, the more control you have over, the more braking mechanisms you have over the government in the future.
If Omar allows me, I think the fluidity of the situation is so great, as it always is. That's why if you're gonna, Mike, if you're gonna bring up any of the names for the prime minister position, I will say I'm not gonna comment on that, because it's not gonna be that name.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, because it keeps changing, by the day, it keeps changing by the week. As we saw with the election of Halbusi. Halbusi was the weakest or the newest of the faces and the names that were proposed, but the speaker, Speaker Halbusi, received the position.
And Jabouri was marginalized quite a bit in his role. He was marginalized and pushed around, and I imagine the one thing about the United States congratulated Halbusi on getting the speakership, and within hours he invited Larijani to Iraq to do a joint statement that they will not support U.S. sanctions on Iran. Yes.
If I can say something, that is not inherently bad from an Iraqi perspective. Right. Iraq knows that it must tread a very fine line between Tehran's interests and Washington's interests.
Why though?
Because Iran is there.
But Canada's here and Mexico's here, and I often say that the Islamic Republic of Mexico doesn't decide our president.
But here, in this situation,
the Islamic Republic of Canada doesn't control our security forces.
In this situation, the United States is the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
So we're the ones pushing Iraq towards Iran.
Not necessarily.
I would agree with that, actually, in a lot of ways, based on our lack of a strategy in Iran, which we'll get to here.
Iraq needs to have a strategic relationship with the United States. I think any rational actor in the political process.
The youth is asking for that as well.
Absolutely. The youth are asking for that. They know that there are enablers, that there are capabilities that only the U.S. can provide. But at the same time, they cannot piss off Iran.
Right.
And I think that puts any Iraqi politician in a position of leadership or decision-making position in a really tough spot. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are pro or anti, but they have to walk a specific.
I completely agree with Omar, and Mike as well. If you look at the Halbusi's background, Speaker Halbusi's background, I think we would find out that he spends more time in Amman than he spends any time anywhere else, as far as I can tell. Actually,
right.
It's because of the background of his political party. The Solution political party, which is controlled by the Karbouli family. They have very strong ties to Jordan because they're based
cross-border.
Absolutely, they're from Anbar themselves, and they have facilitated the presence of U.S. forces in many ways. I'm sure. Many U.S. forces, many U.S. officers will remember their role in the Sahwa.
We were the strongest tribe during the surge.
Exactly.
We're not the strongest tribe anymore.
But I think that we can talk about that. But I also think their regional ties are very important to them. They wouldn't want to sacrifice their ties with Jordan, with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey as the backers of Halbusi, because that's very important.
There could be some external pressure on al-Halbusi to tilt away from this pro-Iran position.
I think so.
He's been criticized for it, at least with his recent statements.
With his recent statement, I think so. I think it's too early to tell if he's pro-US or pro-Iran, but we know his background. We know the background of his backers and his political party, and it's not necessarily pro-Iranian. It's in fact very pro-Jordan, or closer to Jordan, closer to Saudi Arabia, closer to Turkey to an extent, and that's not easy to change as far as I can tell.
As a Syrian American, how much do you see the U.S. failure in Iraq contributing to the problems in Syria, or the U.S. role in Iraq? Let's not call it a failure. Let's just say Iran's role in Iraq, the U.S. role in Iraq, and how that affects Syria.
Sure, that's a very big question.
Yes.
Obviously, Syrians in the country have looked very closely at the way the United States has handled the Iranian militias, and because Syria is between Lebanon and Iraq, where you have two countries where Iran does play a very prominent role, Syrians do have the very real fear that the United States leaving is going to leave them very vulnerable, very susceptible to a long-term Iranian presence inside of the country. And we're already seeing a lot of evidence of that. The Iranian militias, many of them that fight in Iraq and have fought against ISIS, have also been fighting alongside the Assad regime, Asab al-Haq, Harakat Hezbollah. A lot of these have been fighting alongside Qasem Soleimani when he was in Aleppo. There isn't, to the Iranian militias especially, and many of the Iranian sort of military leaders, to them there isn't really a border division between Syria and Iraq. Even though we try to see it still in those terms. And, Iran has been, these militias, they really, and looking at sort of the Hezbollah model, they are there to promote, cultural and long-term, cultural and other political interests of what we see as the Iranian government or the IRGC and these Iranian-backed entities. So, the United States leaving Syria really does scare Syrians. Iran has now universities in every major Syrian city. It has mobilized 32,000 foreign fighters, many of which have not been Iranian. They've been Iraqis, Lebanese, Afghanis, Pakistanis, because Iran doesn't want to have to necessarily pay the very high cost that it would, that they would have to pay if they were bringing Iranians directly from Iran to fight in Syria. They're instead bringing these foreign fighters that they're promising citizenship and other benefits to. And 32,000 is, by many estimates, even more than the ISIS fighters that are, they're in Syria. So to many Syrians, especially those opposed to the Assad regime, especially those watching the severe demographic changes in Syria, what Iran is engineering in Syria is not a short-term plan. It's very much a longer-term proposal that they fear.
And it was done in Baghdad in 05 and 06 with the change in demographics in that city. Right. To your point about the numbers, 32,000 militias, and they have a reserve. In Iraq, we're looking at about 100,000. A lot of those are the Sistani volunteers. So I always carve out the IRGC ones, Kitab Hezbollah, Harakat Najeba, Kitab al-Mali. But we just had this recent estimate, and we're talking about security backslide here in both Iraq. And again, ISIS never saw Iraq and Syria as two different places. Iran doesn't see it as two different places. The United States sees it as two distinct places. Iraq being a place where you operate differently in the north, differently in the Sunni areas, and differently in the south, which is probably the right mix there. And in Syria, one policy east of the Euphrates, one policy west of the Euphrates. But with this new data point that ISIS is at 20 to 30,000 strength again across Iraq and Syria, we're seeing an increase in ISIS attacks in Salahuddin, Diyala, Kirkuk province, and these are places that were liberated, but they were never liberated by empowering Sunnis to liberate these areas. Something that we did in the surge. We empowered Sunnis to secure their own areas because they knew the back alleys, they knew the streets, they knew the people. And in this campaign, we use a proxy force in Syria with the SDF and the YPG, heavy makeup of that construct, and then we use a proxy force in Iraq that is predominantly Shia, and with this controlling element, whether they make up 20% of the Hashd al-Shabi or not, they are the leadership. And the leadership is Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Hadi al-Amri. So this security backslide, we continue to hear, this is long, I know, but we continue to hear these campaign slogans from this administration. ISIS is defeated. We're getting ready to go into 2018 and 2020. Syrians are concerned about the Americans leaving. The appointment of Ambassador Jeffries to the region was key. But in Iraq, we simply are acting like there's nothing going on there. And we're seeing these militias more concerned about fighting in Syria than continuing to fight ISIS or continuing to do things. And I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about security backslide. And I guess my question to you is, Iraq and Syria are tied to the hip, like you said. But do you see security backslide coming at the same time you see the militias dealing with these youth in the south? You talked about a potential clash when the weather changes. I argue that in the winter, more people fight in the winter because it's easier, it's cooler, you can go out. And in the summer, you want to stay in and just kind of relax and watch.
Spoken like a soldier.
Roger. But what are we doing wrong?
Yeah.
What are we doing right?
Can I pick up on that?
Yeah. I want to
Jomana,
and then we'll throw it to you.
I
know that was long.
I could touch on Syria a bit, and then I'd like to hear from Ahmed on Iraq since he just came back. So on Syria, I think there were a couple of things. It's not even that we weren't empowering the Sunni tribes. It was that we weren't empowering the local population, whoever they may be, and bringing in external forces that could be Syrian, but from different parts of the country to then fight ISIS or fight ISIS. That was our only mandate there. What further exacerbated the situation is that we then froze the funds, the stabilization funds, the $200 million, and everyone urged President Trump, please don't do that. We met with Kurds from the Northeast who were like, we just defeated ISIS. We need this money to stabilize these areas. Education is a problem. Some of these kids haven't gone to school for 6-7 years. We're not able to govern these areas. You are leaving us very vulnerable and unable to address these issues so that people can come back home safely. And then coupled with that, of course, there was the announcement that no, our 2,000 soldiers were getting out of there and we're going to let someone else in the region sort of pick up where we left off. So those three things combined were absolutely, I think, a recipe for disaster in Syria. And like you said, we're seeing the appointment of Ambassador Jeffrey sort of backtrack on some of those things that I think have helped temporarily stabilize some of the situation in the, the northeast in Idlib and northeast in al-Qamishli and the northwest in Idlib. But it's still too early to tell. Like all of my co-panelists have said, things could take a turn for the worse very quickly. So
I think, Mike, what I have to report from my trips is that the security situation is backsliding, and there is no point in denying that, by anybody, whether in Baghdad or whether here in DC. I think ISIS is re-energized by the metrics that I have seen in the provinces that you mentioned, and which were cleared of ISIS, but the follow, the build stage, as we remember from the surge days, clear, hold, and build.
Right.
It was clear, there is holding now, but the building is not taking place, and the governance is very weak in those areas. The governance is not being effective, and as a result, if you look at the most recent history of Iraq, it only took 2 years for ISIS to reestablish itself and launch the campaigns to control Mosul and other cities. So,
right.
2 years of bad governance will lead to ISIS again. I have no question in my mind, because we had had a good period of mind, a good period of time, back in 2009, 2010. But then that's when Prime Minister Maliki, now Vice President Maliki, started to take very counterproductive decisions and sectarian-based decisions in many ways, and it led to ISIS. And we want to make sure we avoid that and not rush in terms of the presence of U.S. troops, because that's one thing that I think Iraqis right now agree on, is that there has to, clearly some Iraqis disagree, but the majority want a sustained U.S. presence in the country. And I think it will, if we're just honest with ourselves as analysts and analysts within the government as well, and decision makers within the U.S. government and Iraqi government, I think we will save us a lot of trouble. Because I remember back when I was working at another place, and you remember, Mike, reading our reports when we were saying, at ISW, when we were saying that ISIS is coming back, very few people believed us. A lot of people ridiculed us, and they didn't call us serious, right? But it happened, and we don't want that to happen. That's for sure. But the other backslide in security, clearly, I think, which is concerning, is the targeting of the U.S. embassy in Baghdad with mortar rounds. That hasn't happened in a long time. I think that has
attributed to AH as well.
Exactly. I think the U.S. government attributed it to Iraqi Shia armed groups, and I think we have to take that seriously as well. That cannot continue, because Baghdad is as safe and as stable as I've seen it in about 10 years, and events like that could really destabilize the city and destabilize the population as well.
We could actually find ourselves in the scenario with government formation where even the moderate parties are asking for the U.S. exit of Iraq, and if not an exit, to hide U.S. forces, to not have them out in the open. So, is to that, and I'll open up to questions here in the audience here shortly. Is that something the U.S. should do? Should the U.S. leave with this security backslide issue? If the parties ask the United States to leave, while we have security backslide, where we have this increased Iraqi Quds Force militia presence, where you predict an upcoming clash with the Shia youth and these militias, should the United States leave if asked, or should we simply stay because this part of the world keeps incubating these existential threats?
I think we have to go back and look at the lesson of 2011, when President Obama decided to withdraw U.S. forces. It was a premature decision, and I think Iraqis look at it now and they learned the lesson, of that withdrawal. So having
same lessons we talked about with the Gulf War, continued distrust of U.S. commitments.
I think so, because really right now with 5,000 U.S. troops, the U.S. has a lot of influence, and it can not only political influence but also military influence and hard power influence that you need in Iraq, as you know, Mike. Soft power can only get you so far. You need the hard power with you. So a quick withdrawal of U.S. forces will not be good for Iraq, and I don't think it will be good for U.S. interests either.
Jomana? Okay. Omar?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think if at all possible, we should try to avoid having that debate. when an Iraqi government actually asks the U.S. to leave. That would be ill-advised I think, for any Iraqi government. ISIS is a lot easier to defeat when it's entrenched in a town than to eradicate when it's out in the open.
Well said.
They are resourceful, they are extremely diligent, and they don't waste time. While we're speaking, even though their tempo of operations may be relaxed, I don't think there's no reason for us to think that ISIS is not preparing for its comeback. It has resources all across the region and even in faraway places, and there is no reason to think that they are not working to reestablish their presence in Iraq and in Syria, especially in that vast desert area, east of the Euphrates and west of the Tigris. A continued U.S. presence, I think, is essential, and not only a token presence, but one that is active, and one that is based on addressing the specific enablers that can allow an early detection of a dangerous resurgence, intelligence especially.
What's the unemployment rate in Iraq for the youth? It's about 25%. Is it higher than that? Is it 40%?
I haven't seen the most recent figures. I don't know if my core panelists have.
Depends where.
Somewhere between there is.
Somewhere between 20 and 40%.
And I'd say it's pretty high, and you can clearly tell by where the protests are. The highest places of it. So Basra I think it would be very high. And Maysan province, which is also close to the Iranian border.
Mosul.
I think it will be pretty high. Mosul clearly, but Mosul right now is going through a phase of let's rebuild the city. Let's not focus on the politics of the country at all. Actually,
they're waiting for the money to come in, though. That's
I think so.
They're waiting for the money to come in.
And I think Michael, that's one of the things that did not come up so far is the rebuilding post-ISIS, because before Mosul, a year ago we were talking about post-ISIS and what should be done post-ISIS. I was part of a lot of conversations back then, and I think we have to come back to this conversation now, which is what are we doing post-ISIS, because there isn't a lot going on, and I think with the reconstruction of Mosul, it's very slow. It's actually not happening.
It's not happening. It's not happening in Ramadi either.
Exactly.
And the reason it's not happening is the majority of the parties that won in this election came in first, second, and third. The Nasser party is more inclined to put reconstruction funds in Ramadi and Mosul, but the other two parties were not.
Right.
And what about the bereavement for the Shia volunteers that died fighting ISIS?
Right.
What about these areas? Should it just go to the Sunni areas? And something that the World Bank and the
IMF.
Yeah, IMF have told Baghdad, listen, we're not going to give you this $30 billion in guaranteed funds if you don't push it into these Sunni areas, redirect it, and marginalize and curb the Iranian penetration of economic sectors where Iran has already set up shell companies to do the reconstruction, like they're trying to do in Syria. And the argument that Russia's making that they want U.S. money to be able to do this reconstruction, but they're not reconstructing Sunni areas to bring back in Sunnis. They're reconstructing these areas to bring in new people that are likely to vote for Assad.
They're building a land bridge across Syria right now as we speak for their own interests.
They are, and it's tough when you can't get DOD to admit that there's a land bridge that's being built. I want to open it up to questions, and I'm going to come back and allow you guys to do your 2-minute closing statements as well. We started late. We started at 12:35, so we're going to go to 2:05, and we'll start here with Lori.
Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24. My question, you've presented a very grim view of Iraq, particularly the Bush administration thought it was going to transform the Middle East through democracy in Iraq. So here we are 15 years later. My question to you, do you think the United States should keep muddling on the way it's been going, or is there something, and I realize there's no easy solution or fix on this, but is there a different orientation that the United States might take towards dealing with Iraq, towards making it somehow a better situation in the future?
Who wants to take a first stab?
Okay,
Okay.
Sure.
Omar, you want to take it?
Sure. No, I think, yes, I mean, the prognosis in Iraq has not been great. There has been a lot of setbacks. And part of that is because of the early problems that were, that were made during the political transition in 2003, 2005. Part of that because of the disengagement that happened in 2010, 2011. If there's anything that the U.S. can do is to really to acknowledge the problems, not hope for small problems to go away on their own, but rather to address them head on. Not to overestimate its influence in Iraq, but also not to abandon Iraq to the notion that Iraq is lost to Iran. The relationship has to be based, I think, on an engaged and sincere partnership to get Iraq through the next phase. And I think, like I said earlier, that the next year or so are going to be quite decisive because of the fragmentation of the political establishment. And if we let the political establishment to its own devices and to Iran's manipulation and to the devices of transactional politics, then I think we're going to be next year where we were probably in 2013, and that requires, I think, a doubling down on the diplomatic effort and on a number, I think, of initiatives that probably focus on things related to fighting corruption, increasing accountability, and improving governance.
I think just to my 2 cents to that is that when you said you described Iraq, Lori, in you presented a grim view, I was feeling happy because this is the job that we're supposed to do. Because when it is grim, we have to say it is grim. We have to say it's a bad situation, and clearly the U.S. government has to look at it the same way. And anybody who wants to find real solutions for Iraq has to look at it the same way, because before the elections, there were some discussions and some arguments that sectarianism has disappeared in Iraq. I think the post-election environment tells us sectarianism is very, strong and still entrenched in the country. So we should be honest with ourselves if we really want, some good solutions. So maybe this is just my 2 cents to what Omar said, because I agree with what he said. Yeah.
This is great. We become the counter-narrative panel.
Yeah.
the all is well in Iraq question. Yes, sir. So, can you tell us who you are and then? Oh. Thanks so much.
So again, my name is Anas Ibrahim. I'm a social media influencer. I live in the United States, but most of my videos focus and most of my viewers are in Iraq. The Iraqi youth spend about 300 million hours of watch time on social media with me. I receive about 1,100 messages a day from them, so I'm interacting with them. Actually, Iraq is worse than what we listen to, because when we come here and we listen, we think Iraq is a functioning, real country with democracy, and it's not. And in the past 3 years, I see that sometimes I cannot talk about, and I'll come to a question, sometimes I cannot talk about certain people. Sometimes I felt like the words of al-Sistani, for example, it's set rules to Iraq. And I see the Iraqi youth right now are wanting something from the United States. They want to hear that the United States saying, yes, those politicians are as corrupt as you see them. We're going to do something, and they're waiting for a leader. They're waiting for the rest of the Western world to do something for them. So how can the United States really show those youth that there is future for Iraq?
Sounds good. Yeah. So, well, Anas, thank you so much for your question and even for your comment, because it is important to express and really convey the engagement of the youth, the political engagement of the youth in Iraq, which is pretty high actually. I think it's not necessarily. I don't know what the U.S. can do. I really don't know what the U.S. can do. But the U.S. is well positioned to play a role, and not only a military role, but a diplomatic role, and then this people-to-people role that I think is very important. That's why I mentioned earlier, Consul General Timmy Davis, because in Basra, because I think what he has been doing. And if you don't follow him on Twitter, please go and follow him right after this, because he has been doing a lot of good work in terms of in Basra, which is a difficult place to work, and a place in which I think he started from a difficult point to build the image of the U.S. But that those people-to-people ties, I think, will be very important. And earlier Omar talked about countering corruption, and promoting accountability in Iraq. That's important, but I'm not so sure what the U.S. can do about that. But the youth in Iraq is an apathetic youth when it comes to voting, but when it comes to political attitude and reacting to the politics of the country, it's not an apathetic group at all. That's for
I
sure.
could just follow up that, because what you're expressing here reminds me of the dynamic we also saw in Syria, where you had the youth who were looking for something from democratic countries, some kind of support, some kind of recognition, and to stand by them as like, no, your grievances are real. Yes, these guys are dictators or are, trying to manipulate things in their favor, economically, politically, etc., and really are trying to exclude you and sideline you. And I can understand the importance of that. And I think the one thing that's important, I think, for both people who are watching this outside of Washington and others to know that, contrary to common belief, not everybody in the Middle East thinks that the United States should leave. We can play, some positive roles. And I think even if it's what's the word I'm looking for? Even if it's giving credence to their legitimate uprisings, or if it's a statement or a tweet from the president or something like this,
right.
These things can actually go a long way in lending support.
And that's one of the things they're actually asking for is a economic, educational, and entrepreneurial relationship with the United States. Different types of relationships with the United States, so they can actually believe in a future that's not dependent on aligning with a party.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think that's so important. And the failure of the U.S. to shed a spotlight on the Syrian youth's demands, or at least the things they were worried about, 7 years ago, has resulted in the mess we're in now.
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity for the United States to help cultivate or promote leaders, but Iraqis to identify them themselves. I think it's a great opportunity for the United States, and I don't think it helps when we're not shedding a light on that at all.
If I may add one thing, Anas, I think, thank you so much for your comment. I think you raised a very good point, and you reminded me of a very important point. I think at the end of the day, it is for the Iraqi youth to take their country back through the electoral process. And where the U.S. and where the international community, the UN, where they can really do something is to push for repairing the broken electoral system in Iraq. Not only to push for a more fair and more functional electoral law, but also for a proper and legal implementation of that law, so that we don't have a situation 4 years from now where people lose faith in the election and they boycott it, and then politicians in parliament amend the law that elected them 4 times after the elections have happened retroactively. That is not a functioning electoral system. And I think if there's one critical area where the international community can help is helping Iraq and putting pressure on the Iraqi ruling class to fix that issue, so that the Iraqi youth can, in 4 years, or hopefully even sooner through the provincial councils, change the reality and elect true representatives of their communities.
Yes, sir. And then we'll get right to you.
Arwan Zabari with the Kurdistan Regional Government. One area that has not been mentioned a lot in this conversation is the economy. I think if there's one lesson to be learned from the May 12th election is that battlefield victories did not yield votes among the people. Question for you here is, who is better positioned between the Iran and United States influence in Iraq to empower, to strengthen Iraq's economy, where in turn it will change the public perception and in turn will yield better votes, and then you can shape the next government? So, economy.
I think we're coming with this question, Karwan, good to see you. Zor khosh halbum. I think with this question, we're coming full circle to the crossroad that Iraq really faces now, which is, does it want to have relations with, let's say, the Iranian government only and the Turkish government and the regional countries, or does it want to have, relations and with the international community, writ large? Because we talked a lot about the role of the U.S. here. There are other countries playing a role in Iraq economically and also people to people militarily. Countries, within NATO. I think NATO is going to play an important role moving forward. Not only, and then you bring it back to the economic side. Countries like I think like Spain and other countries, they're trying to work with the Iraqi to improve the Iraqi economy one way or another. But I think all those countries are facing an obstacle called the Iraqi political culture, which is very corrupt, and it doesn't allow for the economy to trickle down to the rest of the population. And that's why I think if it's a top-down effort, and it clearly has to be a top-down effort, I think international institutions will have to play a bigger role as opposed to regional countries, because I think they're the ones with the access to the economy, with the access to the world economy and the world market.
I think Iraq is, just real quick, I think Iraq is positioned to become an actual economic powerhouse if it actually got away from Iran, because a lot of the investment is dependent on keeping the IRGC's penetration of Iraq's economic sectors from being cemented. And Iran is looking to offset U.S. sanctions by using Iraq as a shell company in a lot of ways. But what's interesting now is Iran's economy is so bad, so I think the U.S. is better positioned than Iran is, that Iran's economy is so bad that Iraqis are actually stimulating the Iranian economy by traveling to Iran, by spending money in Iran, because the rial and the toman are so low. So the U.S. simply just has to use that leverage. Did you want to say something?
No, I was just saying, there's no question that the world's largest economy is a safer bet.
Right.
And a country that is, an important neighbor with which Iraq does a lot of business, but is always on the verge of being entirely cut off from the world's financial system.
Right.
So if I were to make a bet, I would probably bet on Washington.
We just want the U.S. to use this $20 trillion economy to be able to do things. Yes, sir. Promised you a question.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. Could we see Quds Force or VAVOC hit teams targeting these Basra youth? And will the Iraqi government stop that in any way? And second, can you shed some light on the relationship between those youths and Sistani? Sistani, in one sense, could be benefiting from this, in that it moves him away from the hegemony of Velayat Faqih. On the other hand, maybe the youths want to get rid of Sistani too. So if Sistani sent representatives to the youths and could find them, what would the message be? What's the view of Sistani of the youths? What's the youth's view of Sistani?
So two questions, the Sistani question and also whether or not these IRGC Quds Force militias have been targeting the protesters, and is the Iraqi military doing anything to stop it?
I think the protesters are saying that they're being targeted. The identities of those who are attacking them probably are not easily trackable to the IRGC. But when you see protesters in Basra, a week or two ago, wearing masks, basically because there are drones circling overhead that are being used to target to identify them and then track them to their homes. There is a robust mechanism that is that's trying to intimidate I think the protesters. So can the government protect them? I mean, the situation right now I think makes it quite difficult to maintain not only just to maintain order, but to go beyond that to to protect protesters. Would welcome anything that Ahmed has on this, but I think it's a very challenging situation for the government because the situation is pretty chaotic at this point. Especially I think with the events of the burning of the consulate and the burning. There's a lot of trigger-happy action, and you come in heavy-handed, you can get tangled in the violence itself, and you can complicate the problem. I'm sorry, what was the other part?
The trust of Sistani and vice versa.
Well, I'm not sure actually. I will need to look this up. I think the Anas probably has a better insight into
Anas, pull a chair up here. Get up here.
What the youth have to say.
Up to 6 months ago, even though I'm not planning on going back to Iraq, I still was very careful to talk about certain people. And in a closed group on Facebook, 20,000 people, I asked if, what do they think of al-Sistani and the political process? And 91% think that the mess we are in is because they listened to him back in 2005. 30% of Iraqi youth, I'm talking from 18 to 34, don't even believe he's alive. And
he is alive. He's alive.
But just the perception of it is that they
I'm
don't.
telling you, this is like in numbers. So people right now really want new faces, completely new faces. That, and I'm talking about the Iraqi youth. They want new faces completely, and they don't want to. They don't want the faces that they see now. So even if I go to them and say, and this is a reason for me that I couldn't convince them to go and vote, because I couldn't tell them, well, there is somebody new, there is somebody good that you could go vote for. Yeah.
Seems like a picture of disillusionment with the existing.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see the Hikma party and you see other parties, even Syria, trying to represent the youth protest in Basra, and the youth saying, well, while we agree with some of your positions, you are part of the problem. You are still them. So it'll just be interesting to see what leaders are cultivated from this movement, because it actually, I believe, is Iraq's best hope, is to have leaders come out of this, at least to balance some of the status quo positions of the parties. I want to just give you each a minute just to say something that you'd like to say, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Let's start with you, Jomana.
Sure. The one thing that I think is worth thinking about is that in reading to prep for this, there were some suggestions that we need to really seriously take the idea of promoting a technocratic government, going back to sort of, having a bunch of technocrats come together to solve some of the economic crises that we discussed earlier. Now, the problem is the annual budget has to actually be approved by the parliament, right? So then you're going to face the political pressure as soon as that happens. But I do think it's something that the United States should really pay attention to and maybe take more seriously, is considering all these protests, they need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed as soon as possible, and economics is at the heart of it. So something has to be done to address that, even outside of sort of the political party debates and races. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. So thank you again, Mike, and thank you all for being here. Three takeaways for me. The first one is that there has to be serious work to restore legitimacy to the Iraqi political process. I think the political process is pretty damaged in Iraq now in the eyes of the population. Second, Iraq really established good relations and built good relations with many countries over the 4 years of fighting ISIS, including the U.S. and NATO. And I think Iraq has to take those relations seriously and not squander them just because of government formation or just because of the wishes of some regional countries. And thirdly, and very importantly, I think governance will be key for Iraq moving forward. Iraqi politicians have not learned the lessons of the rise of ISIS, and I think one of those lessons was good governance is key, because without good governance, you can really have a very unstable country.
I would say that I would go back and say that the next year is going to be quite important. I think Iraq does not have a problem with generating income, but has a big problem spending it rationally. And I think that's an area where the U.S. can be more energetic, engaging the next Iraqi government to make sure that at least some segment of Iraq's revenue is spent on critical projects that can address some of the most dire needs of Iraq's populace: water in Basra, electricity, and issues like that. Things that can actually bring down the temperature of the of the protest movement. The other part is, of course, the electoral process. Legitimacy of that has to be restored. We need to rethink the legitimacy and credibility of the election commission. And we need not to be lazy about ISIS. While everyone is distracted with government formation and with manipulating the protest or capitalizing on them, the politicians, we need to, the U.S. and the Iraqis and the coalition need to not lose sight that ISIS is making its preparations. It's not wasting time to make preparations to come back.
Well, thank you all for being here today. That was excellent. I appreciate all of your analysis and all of your comments, and thank you to our audience for coming today. Thanks to C-SPAN for being here, and we'll do this again in a couple months and see where we're at.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.